The marble floors of Sterling Industries gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Marcus Hayes pushed his mop bucket toward the executive suite. It was nearly midnight, and the 42-year-old janitor moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to make himself invisible. His daughter Emma's medication cost $400 every 2 weeks, and this night shift was the only thing standing between them and eviction. But when the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Marcus froze. The CEO herself stood there, Victoria Sterling, in a crimson suit that probably cost more than his yearly salary, her eyes scanning him with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something found on the bottom of a shoe. She didn't speak to him, not at first. She simply stepped around him, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp, dismissive taps. Marcus had cleaned these halls for 3 years and had never crossed paths with her directly. He knew the stories, though. Everyone did. Victoria Sterling had built her tech empire from nothing, or so the business magazines claimed. Now she ruled over 3,000 employees with an iron fist and a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in her way. Marcus kept his head down and continued toward the executive washroom. His shoulders ached from the double shift at the warehouse he'd worked that morning, and his left knee throbbed, a reminder of a life he'd left behind long ago. Emma had been feverish when he'd dropped her at his neighbor Mrs. Chen's apartment, her small hand clutching his work shirt, as he'd promised her he'd be home before she woke up. He always kept his promises to Emma. She was all he had left after the accident that took her mother 5 years ago. The sound of Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She was on her phone, her tone sharp and businesslike, discussing quarterly projections and market shares. Marcus disappeared into the washroom, grateful for the reprieve. But as he emerged 15 minutes later, his mop bucket caught on the doorframe, and water sloshed across the polished floor, right in front of where Victoria now stood, apparently waiting for something. She looked down at the puddle spreading toward her Italian leather heels, and something dark flickered across her face. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. Marcus had seen that expression before, in a different life, on different faces, the look of someone about to unleash their power on someone they considered beneath them. Victoria's assistant, a thin woman with nervous eyes, appeared from nowhere with a towel. But Victoria waved her away, her gaze fixed entirely on Marcus. And then she noticed it, the edge of a tattoo peeking out from beneath his collar. It was just a glimpse, a fragment of black ink against his brown skin. But something about it made her pause. Her expression shifted from disgust to something else. Confusion, perhaps, or recognition. Marcus quickly mopped up the spill, his heart pounding. He needed this job. Emma needed this job. But as he straightened, he caught Victoria staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought she might try to see more of the tattoo. Then she turned and walked away without a word, leaving Marcus alone in the hallway with his racing thoughts and the echo of her heels fading into the distance. He had no way of knowing that in that single moment, Victoria Sterling's perfectly constructed world had just begun to crack. The next morning arrived too soon. Marcus had managed 3 hours of sleep before Emma's alarm pulled him back to consciousness. She was better. Her fever had broken, but her eyes still carried that exhausted look that broke his heart every single time. At 8 years old, she'd already been through more hospital visits than most adults, and yet she smiled at him over her cereal like he'd hung the moon. Marcus got her to school and made it to his warehouse job by 7:30. The work was brutal, loading and unloading trucks, lifting boxes that made his back scream in protest. But he needed both jobs. The medical bills never stopped coming, and Emma's condition required constant monitoring. The other workers didn't talk to him much. He preferred it that way. Conversations led to questions, and questions led to a past he'd worked hard to bury. At 11, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Chen. Emma picked up early from school. Not feeling well. I have her. Marcus's stomach dropped. He stared at the message, calculating how much it would cost him to leave early, how angry his supervisor would be, how close they were to missing rent. But Emma came first. Emma always came first. He made it to Mrs. Chen's apartment by noon, his shirt soaked with sweat from running the 6 blocks from the bus stop. Emma lay on the couch, pale but conscious, her small body curled around her favorite stuffed rabbit. The old woman handed him a thermometer reading, 101. Not emergency level, but concerning enough. Marcus carried Emma home and settled her into bed. He'd have to miss the night shift at Sterling Industries, which meant less money, but there was no choice. He spent the afternoon monitoring her temperature, making soup she barely touched, and telling her stories about brave princesses who fought dragons. She fell asleep around 4, her hand wrapped around his thumb. That's when his phone rang, unknown number. The voice on the other end was professional, female, and unwelcome. It was Victoria Sterling's assistant. There had been a complaint filed about his work performance. Water damage to an expensive rug, failure to follow safety protocols. He was being asked to come in immediately to discuss his employment status. Marcus closed his eyes. The rug had been fine. He'd cleaned the spill completely. This was something else. This was Victoria Sterling deciding he was a problem that needed to be eliminated. He looked at Emma, sleeping beside him, her breathing finally steady and peaceful. He thought about the tattoo Victoria had glimpsed the night before, the one that marked him as something he'd tried so hard to forget. The memories crashed over him like a wave. Sand and blood, brothers lost, missions that broke good men into pieces, and the day he'd walked away from it all because Emma needed a father, more than his country needed another ghost. Marcus had been someone once, someone important, someone dangerous. But that man had died the day Emma's mother passed, and in his place stood just a father trying to survive. He texted Mrs. Chen to come stay with Emma and took the bus back to Sterling Industries. If Victoria Sterling wanted to fire him, she'd have to do it to his face. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally see the full tattoo. The one that identified him as more than just a janitor, with a mop and a bucket. The one that marked him as a recipient of the Medal of Honor. The one that told anyone who knew how to read it that Marcus Hayes had once been Captain Marcus Hayes, Special Forces, the man who'd saved 17 lives in Kandahar and lost everything that mattered in the process. The bus rolled through the city streets as the sun began to set, and Marcus wondered if tonight would be the night his past and present finally collided. Sterling Industries looked different in the early evening light, cold and imposing, like a fortress built to keep people like Marcus on the outside looking in. He entered through the employee entrance, his work uniform freshly changed, his janitor's badge clipped to his collar. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he signed in, but the security guard, a younger guy named Devon who sometimes made small talk, gave him a sympathetic look. Word traveled fast in places like this. Marcus took the service elevator to the top floor, his reflection staring back at him from the polished metal doors. He looked tired, worn down, nothing like the soldier he'd once been, but beneath the exhaustion, beneath the worry lines and the gray creeping into his hair, something harder remained, something that never fully went away, no matter how many floors he mopped, or how many times he told himself he was just a father now. Victoria Sterling's office occupied the entire western corner of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the furniture probably cost more than most people's houses. She sat behind a massive glass desk, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression unreadable as Marcus entered. Her assistant gestured for him to sit in the chair across from Victoria, then quietly disappeared. Closing the door behind her, the silence stretched between them like a battlefield. Victoria studied him with those sharp blue eyes, and Marcus could feel her dissecting him, trying to understand what she'd glimpsed the night before. Finally, she spoke, her voice cool and controlled, informing him that multiple complaints had been filed about his work quality, that the company had standards, that she couldn't afford to keep employees who damaged company property. Marcus listened without interrupting. He'd heard speeches like this before, from different people in different contexts. They all sounded the same, justifications for cruelty dressed up in professional language. When she finished, he simply asked if he could respond. Victoria looked surprised by the steadiness in his voice, by the quiet authority that leaked through despite his position. She nodded once. Marcus didn't defend himself against the false accusations. Instead, he asked her a direct question. What had she really seen in that hallway? Because this wasn't about a wet floor or a damaged rug. This was about the tattoo, and they both knew it. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly. She stood and moved to the window, her back to him. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight he hadn't expected. She told him about her brother, about how he'd served 3 tours overseas, about how he'd come home different, broken in ways that no one could fix, about how he'd died 2 years ago from an overdose because the VA had failed him, because the system had failed him, because everyone had failed him. Her brother had a tattoo identical to the one she'd glimpsed on Marcus, a military honor tattoo, one that only a select few received. She turned back to face him, and for the first time, Marcus saw something other than ice in her eyes. He saw grief, raw and unprocessed, the kind that made people build empires just to avoid feeling it. Victoria asked him directly, who was he really? Marcus could have lied, could have kept his head down and walked away, but something about her pain, about the mention of her brother, cracked open a door he'd kept locked for 5 years. He stood slowly, maintaining eye contact, and loosened his collar, revealing the full tattoo, the eagle, the flag, the inscription that marked him as a recipient of the nation's highest honor. He told her his name, his real name, Captain Marcus Hayes, Special Forces, decorated for valor after saving 17 Marines under heavy fire in Kandahar. He told her about the aftermath, about coming home to a hero's welcome that meant nothing because his wife was dying of cancer, about choosing Emma over his career, about the PTSD that made him wake up screaming some nights, about becoming a janitor because night shifts paid better and let him be there. For his daughter during the day, he told her about the system that gave him a medal but couldn't give him affordable health care for his dying wife, about the VA that offered pamphlets instead of real help, about what it meant to be a hero in a country that thanked you for your service and then forgot you existed. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when he finished, something fundamental had shifted in the room. She asked about Emma, about her condition, about his situation, and then Victoria Sterling did something that shocked them both. She apologized. The apology hung in the air like something fragile and unexpected. Victoria moved back to her desk, but this time she didn't sit behind it. She perched on the edge instead, closer to Marcus, her professional armor visibly cracking. She told him about her brother's final months, how he'd pushed everyone away, how he'd refused help, how she'd been too busy building her empire to notice he was drowning. The guilt had eaten at her ever since, transforming her into something harder, colder. She'd thrown herself into work because it was easier than feeling. She'd judged everyone around her because it was safer than examining her own failures. And when she'd seen that tattoo on Marcus's neck, it had triggered something she'd been trying to bury for 2 years. Marcus understood. He'd seen it in other veterans, in other families destroyed by war's aftermath. Grief had a way of reshaping people into unrecognizable versions of themselves. But Victoria wasn't finished. She asked him about Emma's medical condition, and Marcus found himself explaining the genetic disorder that required constant medication and monitoring, the bills that never stopped coming, the insurance that covered almost nothing, the constant fear that one day he'd have to choose between paying rent and keeping his daughter alive. Victoria listened with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. This wasn't pity in her eyes. It was something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. He couldn't tell which. Then she made him an offer that sounded too good to be real, a position in her company's security department. Full benefits, including comprehensive health coverage that would cover Emma's treatments, a salary that would let him work 1 job instead of 2, a chance to actually be present in his daughter's life. Marcus's first instinct was suspicion. Nothing came free, especially not from billionaires with reputations for ruthlessness. He asked what she wanted in return. Victoria's answer surprised him. She wanted to start a veteran support program within her company. She wanted Marcus to help design it, to use his experience to create something that actually worked. She wanted to do for others what she'd failed to do for her brother. It sounded noble, but Marcus had learned long ago that nobility rarely survived contact with reality. He told her he'd think about it, that he needed to consider Emma first. Always Emma first. Victoria nodded, understanding in a way that suggested she knew he'd see through any false promises. As Marcus stood to leave, Victoria stopped him with a question that cut deeper than expected. Did he regret it? Giving up his career, his identity, everything he'd been to become just a father? Marcus looked at her directly, and for the first time that night he smiled. A small, tired smile that carried 5 years of exhaustion and love. He told her that being Emma's father wasn't giving up anything. It was the only thing he'd ever done that actually mattered. The medals, the honors, the respect, none of it compared to the way Emma looked at him when he tucked her in at night. The empire Victoria had built, he said gently, would crumble eventually. But Emma would remember her father showing up every single day. That was the only legacy worth leaving. Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a crack in the foundation she'd built around herself. She asked if she could meet Emma sometime, not as a CEO, just as someone who needed to remember what actually mattered. Marcus hesitated. Emma was his world, and he protected her fiercely from anything that might hurt her. But he also recognized the desperate need in Victoria's eyes, the same need he'd seen in the mirror during those first months after his wife died. He told her maybe that he'd think about that too. As he left Sterling Industries that night, the city lights spreading below him like fallen stars, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. It was terrifying and fragile, but it was there. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Emma was awake and asking for him, asking if he'd remembered to bring her favorite ice cream. Marcus smiled and headed for the all-night grocery store, because that's what fathers did. They showed up. They remembered the small things. They kept their promises even when the world forgot them. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, someone else noticed. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in Sterling Industries' new training facility, watching as 20 veterans went through orientation for the company's freshly launched support program. Victoria had moved fast, faster than he'd thought possible. The program offered job placement, mental health resources, family support, and comprehensive benefits. It was everything her brother might have needed, rebuilt as a memorial that actually helped people. Marcus had accepted the security director position, though he still felt uncomfortable in the polo shirt and slacks that replaced his janitor's uniform. Emma's medical bills were now covered completely. He worked one job with reasonable hours. He picked his daughter up from school most days and had dinner with her every night. The panic that had been his constant companion for 5 years had started to loosen its grip, but the transformation that mattered most wasn't his own. Victoria had changed. Not completely. She was still demanding, still sharp, still the CEO who'd built an empire. But something had softened around the edges. She'd started showing up to the veteran support sessions, listening to stories, learning names. She'd created a scholarship fund for veterans' children, and twice now she'd joined Marcus and Emma for ice cream, sitting awkwardly at the sticky table in their neighborhood shop, trying to figure out how to talk to an 8-year-old Emma had taken to calling her Miss Victoria, which made the Billionaire CEO smile in a way that suggested she'd forgotten how. The real test came on a Thursday afternoon when Emma had an emergency hospital visit. Marcus got the call during a security briefing, and his old instincts kicked in. The panic, the calculation of what this would cost. The fear that had defined his existence for so long. But this time was different. Victoria simply told him to go, that his daughter came first, always. And when Marcus arrived at the hospital, he found that Victoria had already called ahead, ensuring Emma was seen immediately by the best specialists, that everything was covered, that there would be no bureaucratic nightmares to navigate while his daughter lay in a hospital bed. Emma was fine, just a medication adjustment needed. But as Marcus sat beside her bed, holding her small hand while she slept, Victoria appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there for a moment, and Marcus could see the grief and regret playing across her face, the brother she couldn't save reflected in the daughter Marcus could. When Emma woke up, she asked Victoria if she had any siblings. The question, so innocent and direct, made Victoria's eyes glisten. She told Emma about her brother, about how he'd been brave and funny and kind, about how she missed him every day. about how meeting Emma and her father had helped her remember the good parts instead of just the ending. Emma, with the wisdom of children who've spent too much time in hospitals, simply said that he sounded nice and that she bet he was proud of Miss Victoria for helping other people like her dad. Something broke in Victoria then, something that needed to break. She cried quietly, and Emma, with her typical fearlessness, reached out and held the billionaire CEO's hand the same way she held her father's. Marcus watched these two people who'd changed his life, and he understood that sometimes redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it was just about showing up, about seeing people, about choosing, every single day, to do better than yesterday. The program Victoria had built would help hundreds of veterans and their families. Emma would grow up healthy and loved, and Victoria Sterling would continue building her empire. But now with a foundation that actually mattered, one built on honoring the people who'd given everything and asking for so little in return. As they left the hospital that evening, Emma between them holding both their hands, Marcus thought about the night he'd spilled water in that hallway. How a single moment, a glimpse of a tattoo, had unraveled two people's carefully constructed defenses and rebuilt them into something better. He thought about all the other veterans out there, still fighting invisible wars in their own hallways, still trying to be both heroes and fathers, still invisible to a world that had moved on without them, and he hoped that somewhere another person would see them, really see them, and remember that heroism wasn't just about what you did in war. It was about what you chose to do every day after, when no one was watching, when there were no medals or recognition. It was about showing up for an 8-year-old girl who needed her medication, about keeping promises, about choosing love over legacy. That night, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed in their small apartment that finally felt like home instead of a foxhole, she asked him if he still missed being a soldier. Marcus smoothed her hair back and told her the truth. He was still a soldier. He just fought different battles now, and these ones, with her by his side, were the only ones that had ever really mattered. Outside, the city hummed with millions of invisible stories. And in one corner office, a billionaire CEO sat alone with a photograph of her brother, finally understanding that the best memorial wasn't built of glass and steel. It was built of second chances, of seeing people, of learning that real strength meant letting your heart crack open. Sometimes, heroes don't wear medals anymore. Sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and carry mop buckets. Sometimes they raise daughters and fight invisible wars. Sometimes they just show up day after day, quietly saving the only world that matters, the small one built around the people they love. And sometimes, if the universe is kind, someone notices. Someone sees. Someone remembers that beneath every uniform, every tattoo, every title, there's just a person trying to do right by the ones they love. That's the story no one tells, but it's the only one that really matters.